All righty. If anybody needs seats, there is room down front. Oh, it went all quiet. Good. Don't know my own strength. Hi, I'm Liz Clark from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and I have the honor of introducing Malin Pinsky from the Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources Department at Rutgers University. Of course, for this Bevan series on climate and fisheries sustainability, a talk called Fish and Fisheries in Hot Water, How Do We Adapt, is pretty relevant. But it's really hard to describe Malin's research in just a few words, and that diversity makes it relevant to what we do in the Bevan in general, which is to bring in new perspectives and diverse perspectives. Dr. Pinsky's lab is one-stop shopping for diverse research topics. His lab has one of the broadest research portfolios I've ever seen. Kind of makes me think, what have I been doing with my life? From assessing wave energy, determining extinction risks, understanding larval dispersal, analyzing how fishing communities will be able to respond to changing climate, valuing ecosystem services, all this in the same lab, in the same research portfolio, and the perspectives are all different. We have big picture, small picture, ecosystem processes to conservation policy modeling to on-the-ground real field work in the Philippines. We also have a geographic perspective that's pretty broad, from the tropics, the Philippines, collaborators in American Samoa, Papua New Guinea, and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in New England. So we have a really broad perspective in one person here. And just to illustrate that just a little more, in the thoughtful essay on how to bring creativity into conservation science, and the title of this is Cultivating Creativity in Conservation Science. I told you his research interests were pretty diverse. He and his co-authors make the point that there are key ways to infuse creativity into your science. In essence, what they say is when you break down barriers and expose people to new concepts, new environments, and perspectives, you participate in what they call a learning, struggle, and reflection cycle. It sounds like the Bevan series to me. And that in turn can trigger neurophysiological changes that allow the brain to become more creative. And that sounds like fun to me. So let's get on board. Let Malin trigger some neurophysiological changes in us by presenting some new perspectives on the effects of temperature on fish and fisheries.
Thank you, Liz, for that introduction. Thank you, Julia and Yamini, for the invitation to come out here and for setting up my visit. And to all of you for coming today. It's been a wonderful day so far, a busy day of hearing about a lot of the fantastic research that's going on here. And I know it's going to be a busy day tomorrow as well. And I will say, maybe a slight follow-up to Liz's introduction, I have people in Seattle to blame for much of the diversity in my research portfolio, which is including many people sitting in this room, which is kind of fun. It's fun to see a lot of familiar faces out here. But I guess the theme that motivates a lot of the work in my lab is trying to understand how ecological communities respond to environmental change. And we look at that across scales, from genomics up to communities. And because we're interested in the marine environment, that naturally includes people in fisheries. And I'll be talking about some of that work today. As by way of context, temperature is this really fascinating factor that sets an incredibly diverse number of rates, from physics to chemistry to biology. And as we know, the thermal environment in which life is found on Earth has been changing substantially. The animation you just saw shows in orange and red some of the parts of the world that have warmed the most over the last 50 years, an animation from NASA. On the other hand, these average temperatures, at least as this map shows, we're talking about like 2 degrees Celsius. Does that really matter for life? And not only that, if you go drop our head down to the surface of the water, we've got 2 environments here, terrestrial and marine. And I think it'd be very tempting to think that the effects of warming are playing out very similarly under the ocean surface as compared to what they're doing on land. But one of the things I want to argue is that there's some really interesting differences actually in terms of how the effects of warming are playing out. And then I'll try to trace those through to impacts on people and fisheries. Now, just to start with, in the ocean, this is where 90% of the habitable space on Earth is found. It's also where 93% of the heat from global warming has gone. So an enormous amount of heat is being absorbed by the ocean. On the other hand, water has a really high specific heat, so about 4 times higher than air, so it can absorb a lot of heat without changing that much in temperature. We're also talking about an enormous water bath as well. The oceans are really big, about 1.3 sextillion liters to be a little bit more precise. So a lot of heat can go in without temperature actually changing all that much. And this is one of the things we see in terms of, the temperature records from the land surface and from the ocean surface. And actually, before I get too far in, folks who are sitting on the stairs, there are plenty of seats up front if you want to come down. You don't want to sit on a concrete chair for the next 45 minutes or whatever. Come on down. So in the ocean, surface temperatures have gone up about 0.5 degrees Celsius in the last 150 years. Compare that to the land surface, it's gone up about 1.3 degrees Celsius over the same period of time. On the other hand, the ocean is also a thermally much less variable environment as well. So in this graph, horizontal axis is latitude, so South Pole, equator, North Pole. And then on the vertical axis, we've got seasonality. So it's the standard deviation of monthly temperatures. And so on land, that green line, high seasonality at the poles, highly variable, not so much at the equator. When we're in the ocean, in general, much less variable, especially at the poles and at the tropics. Overall, about 6 times lower thermal variation. And so one of the things that means is that even a relatively small increase in temperature is a lot compared to the experience of an individual organism or even the history of an evolutionary lineage in the ocean. The ocean is also less spatially variable in terms of temperature as well. So there are relatively more microclimates on land. You think about shade or moving slightly higher in a mountain or even onto the north side of a mountain. Those cooler or warmer microclimates are relatively more accessible on land as compared to how accessible they are in the ocean. What that means, one of the things that means is that behavioral thermoregulation appears to be a more viable strategy for coping with temperature variation on land as compared to the ocean. So, for example, moving into shade, being active at night, moving underground, or even taking advantage of evaporation, something that's available on land for many species. The last thing, in terms of sort of interesting, at least in my mind, sort of interesting physical differences between the 2 environments, that I think sets up sort of the physics of some of what I'll be talking about later, is that oxygen is also much less available in the ocean. So at least one of the key hypotheses for why temperature is maybe affecting many marine species is that as temperature goes up, metabolic rates go up, and eventually it's hard for marine ectotherms to get enough oxygen out of the water to meet their metabolic demand. It's much less of a limit on land. So sort of with these sort of pretty fundamental physical differences between the 2 environments, I want to spend some time over the next 45 minutes or so thinking about how are marine animals responding to changes in temperature. How does that compare to what we're seeing on land? And then start thinking about what are the impacts, trace those impacts through to impacts on people and fisheries, and then end by thinking about a little bit about should we adapt to these changes? Can we adapt? And how could we go about doing that? So just on this first question, how are marine animals responding? One useful way of thinking about impacts of temperature on organisms is also often in terms of a thermal performance curve. So there's some maximum temperature that an organism can tolerate, some minimum temperature, and then relative fitness is higher between those two, sort of a useful cartoon. But these can be relatively wide or relatively narrow. And one of the things that is often used to think about temperature, the sensitivity to variation in temperature, is the thermal tolerance breadth. Just how wide, what's the distance between the minimum and maximum physiological tolerance. So one of the things that I've been working on with a number of colleagues, including Jennifer Sunday, who's here at University of Washington, is pulling together data from physiological studies across a wide range of species. These sort of thermal tolerance minima and maxima are collected for lots of ectotherms on land and in the ocean, and allows us to look at thermal tolerance breadth across these two ecosystems. So each of the dots here represents a species that was collected from a particular location and shows thermal tolerance breadth on the vertical axis, again across latitudes on land in green and in blue in the ocean. And just to show you a couple examples, subantarctic caterpillar tolerates that thermal tolerance breadth 45 degrees Celsius. Not too far away, though, and Antarctic icefish lives in an incredibly thermally stable environment under the ice surface, tolerates an 11-degree range of temperatures. So across latitudes, one of the things that I think is really striking is how much this mirrors latitudinal patterns of temperature variability as well. So on land, high at the poles, lower at the equator. In the ocean, low at the equator and the poles. But in general, much lower in the ocean than on land. On average, about 10 degrees lower thermal tolerance breadth in the ocean than on land. So that suggests that marine species are more sensitive to the same amount of thermal variation, but it doesn't actually tell us whether they're more sensitive to warming. Because it depends on actually how close they live to that their upper thermal tolerance. And there's lots of really interesting debate actually about the appropriate way to measure these. But one way to measure sensitivity to warming is the distance between the habitat temperature that species live at. And there's actually a figure in part pulled from a paper that Curtis has published a little while ago. And the maximum thermal tolerance that a species or a population can tolerate. I want to say that these physiological tolerance measurements are typically acute tolerances. So measured over hours. So probably the most appropriate measure of environmental temperature is not necessarily the average, but actually the upper extreme of what a species is likely to experience. So one of the things we've been doing is actually comparing these upper thermal tolerances to the hottest hour, or say the 95% percentile hottest hour that a species is likely to experience in its environment. So I'm just showing those environmental data across latitudes here, though we've used actually sort of spatially resolved data for the actual calculations. So this is on the vertical axis, the hottest hour at a given latitude, and again, South Pole, equator, North Pole. So in the ocean, the hottest hour is found in the tropics. But on land, it's actually, I was kind of surprised, though it makes sense when I stopped to think about it. The hottest hours are actually found at intermediate latitudes. So where they're really long, they're longer summer days. There's more time to heat up. Also where the deserts are found. It's actually not necessarily in the tropics. So when we put these two things together, what we find actually is that thermal safety margins are actually lowest in the tropics in the ocean, but actually lowest on land at intermediate latitudes. And overall, these thermal safety margins are thinner for marine ectotherms than they are for terrestrial ectotherms, suggesting that marine species, again, are more sensitive to warming as well than many terrestrial species will be. On the other hand, as I mentioned, there's ongoing debate about whether this is the most appropriate way to measure sensitivity to warming. It's one way that we can do it, that we can compare across a wide range of species and across ecosystems like this. So we were really interested in, do we actually see the consequences of what appears to be different sensitivity in the ecological patterns that we can measure through time as well? So, for example, do we see higher rates of local extinction or extirpation in the ocean as a result of warming than we see on land? So we wanted to test for that. So we're doing that by looking at, again, pulling together synthesis across different studies that have been done, looking at resurveys of the warm range edge for a species. So if you think about population or species spread across latitudes, there's a warm range edge, a cold range edge. We're looking at studies that have resurveyed the location of that warm range edge and either determined whether they're still found in the same place or maybe even actually extended to warmer latitudes through time, or has there been a contraction of that warm range edge? And we've got data for about 100 species in the ocean. Of those, about half of those show a contraction of that warm range edge through time. About the same number of species for which we could pull together data on land, about a quarter of those show range edge contraction. On the other hand, potentially there are methodological differences that could explain some of these differences between the studies. So we've tried looking at taxonomic differences, latitude at which these studies were conducted, duration, does that affect it, the methods that were used, but still there do seem to be strong differences between these two ecosystems in terms of the rates at which, or the proportion of these resurveys that are showing range contractions at that warm range edge, which I think is actually quite consistent with this idea that marine species are actually more sensitive to warming than we're seeing on land. So we're seeing local extinctions happening at a higher rate in the ocean. Local extinctions could even, they could be extirpated from their entire original range. But on the other hand, that doesn't necessarily mean that global rates of extinction will be different. That really depends on whether or not species can colonize new territory. And the other thing that we see happening in the ocean from work that other folks have done is actually that colonization rates are also faster in the ocean than they are on land, about 10 times faster, in fact. Which raises, I think, the interesting question of, it looks like we're seeing marine species actually shifting entire distributions. So are they tracking thermal habitats? So that's a question we've tried to test actually at a species-specific level using a lot of the ecological surveys that the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada have collected. So now, rather than synthesizing existing literature, we're actually going back to the original data sets and actually ecological surveys. And one of the things that my lab has done quite a bit over the last few years is trying to pull together a wide range of ecological surveys for the continental shelf ecosystems in North America, and trying to stitch them together in a way that they're at least comparable to each other. And so we've pulled together data, everything from subarctic ecosystems in Eastern Bering Sea down to subtropical ecosystems in the Gulf of Mexico and up to Newfoundland and Labrador. Some of these surveys start in the 1960s and give us, getting close to 50 years of perspective of ecological change, both in species distributions and community composition over that time period. And I think these comparisons across different ecosystems, some of which have warmed, some have cooled, some haven't changed much in temperature at all, some have very intense fisheries, some have less intense fisheries, has been a really useful way for making progress on these questions. So these are bottom trawl surveys, which means that most of them are set up with a stratified random design. Many of them are annual, some are every few years. But they go out, drop a net on the bottom of the ocean, pull it along the bottom, and count and weigh what they pull up. So some of the species that are caught are, commercially important fish, like cods and flounders. There are invertebrates like lobsters and crabs, and also a wide range of non-commercial species as well. And just to summarize a fair bit of analysis, or relatively succinctly, we can zoom in on the northeast US, and we can plot the centroid of a species distribution, in this case, American lobster in the late 1960s, on that map. So just to orient you, since we've moved to the East Coast, we've got New York City here, Boston, all the way up to Canada. And the center of that lobster distribution then, over the course of these surveys, has been shifting to the northeast at about 70 kilometers per decade, moving quite rapidly. But on the other hand, when we look across species, we see a lot of variation. And that kind of variation is actually very common in data sets like this. Everything from plants, trees, small mammals, other fish and invertebrates, and other parts of the ocean. There's a lot of variation from one region to the next and one species to the next, even within a region. So lobster may be shifting northeast quite rapidly, but other species have actually shifted south over that time period, some not moving much at all. The average across species is about 20 kilometers per decade to the northeast, consistent with the warming that has been observed in this region. But one of the things that I was really intrigued in is trying to understand this variation across species and across regions. So one of the concepts that we found especially useful is this idea of climate velocity. So climate velocity is the rate at which isotherms are shifting. So if you think about a gradient in temperature, warmer, cooler, if you pick a particular temperature, you could draw that line on a map. And then as a gradient warms or cools, that isotherm moves. And it moves at a particular direction and at a particular rate. And it's that combination of rate and direction that we call climate velocity. And so some of the work that we've done is to compare the rate and direction that those isotherms are shifting. That's the x-axis here, measured in this case in degrees latitude per year, against the shift in species centroid from the ecological surveys I just showed you. Again, measured in degrees latitude per year. So each of the dots here is a species within a region. And this red line actually is the one-to-one line. So species follow climate velocity perfectly, they'd be right on that red line. Clearly not. There's a lot that affects species distribution. But one of the things that I was really surprised by was that we can explain about 40% of the variation across these species based on how fast isotherms in a given region are shifting. And that actually can explain there's a lot of variation from one place to the next. And that depends both on the spatial gradient in temperature, but also whether temperatures are warming or cooling in a given region. And because these ecological surveys cover a few decades, that's a scale actually where at a regional scale, we actually in some places see cooling. There's actually been quite a bit of cooling on the west coast of the US, for example. It's a result of climate variation like Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So the same data set actually allows us to ask whether marine species are lagging behind climate velocities. And we can do that by just measuring the distance from the one-to-one line to how fast species actually were observed to be shifting. And what we find, if you think of the difference in the rate of shift, either they're speeding ahead or they're lagging behind. For marine species, on average, we find that they're actually not speeding ahead or lagging behind. There are relatively few barriers to dispersal in the ocean. Marine species tend to be relatively mobile. We've also spent a fair bit of time looking at life history traits that may help explain why some species are lagging behind more than others. Growth rates seem to matter a little bit, but a very minor effect compared to just the overall effect of how fast are those isotherms moving in a given region. And one of the things I've been really interested in is that it's actually a very different story than what we see coming out of research on land. We're across a wide range of species, birds to butterflies, small mammals, trees, plants. Many terrestrial species are lagging behind climate velocities. And that may have to do with what I mentioned before, dispersal and relative barriers to dispersal in these two environments. Not only is colonization easier in the ocean, but from what I showed you earlier, it also seems like marine species are actually quite sensitive to that warming, and extirpations maybe are happening faster in the ocean as well, so on both range edges. So what I've shown you are long-term responses over decades, sort of long-term shifts in species distributions. We've also been interested in whether we're also seeing responses over much shorter time scales as well. Do we see rapid responses just to temperature variability, not necessarily long-term trends? This was actually inspired by some work that a postdoc in the lab, Jim Morley, was doing looking at the southeast US, where over the period of time where we have ecological surveys, there haven't been long-term trends in temperature, but there has been a lot of variation. And he was interested in whether these just annual anomalies in biomass, and he also looked at species distributions, were related to temperature. Take out the long-term trend and just look at the annual anomalies. And this is just one example of a species he looked at, Atlantic moonfish. And for this particular species, there was a positive relationship between the winter temperature anomaly, so the previous winter's temperature, and the biomass anomaly. After a warm winter, there tended to be more moonfish. After a cold winter, there tended to be fewer. The question, though, wasn't about moonfish in particular, though. It was about the variation across species in this community. And so we looked at a bunch of different species. And what I'm showing you here on this vertical axis is whether species had a positive biomass response to winter temperatures or a negative response, or right on this red line, really no response at all. So moonfish had a positive response up there. There were more moonfish after a warm winter. And there's a lot of variation across species, but what was interesting actually is that whether species responded positively, negatively, or really not at all was actually well predicted by thermal preference measured from spatial data that we also had in terms of where in a species, where along sort of the East Coast these species were found. And that shows up statistically as, if you go back to those interannual anomalies, it actually shows up as this interaction. It's not just the winter temperature, but the interaction of the winter temperature with the temperature preference of a species that determines whether they have a positive or a negative anomaly in a given year. And it's also worth saying that Jim looked at actually a range of different metrics of temperature, and winter temperature in particular seemed to be the most important in this particular ecosystem. But the mechanism actually seems quite different depending on which species we are looking at. For some species, like star drum, it seemed to be that overwinter juvenile mortality was the most important process. So this is a species where the juveniles spend their first winter in estuaries. Estuaries are shallow. It's a really cold winter. That water column gets really cold. And star drum, actually, not all that many survived. So there's a small cohort out on the continental shelf the next year when the survey came through. The opposite after a warm winter. In other cases, though, for species like bluefish or some of the sharks, it seemed to be a question of migration phenology, so actually about adult behavior that was driving these patterns that we were seeing in this ecological survey. So after a cold winter, bluefish don't have, they've got lower energy reserves, and they spend the winter in the southeast US, and in most summers migrate up to the northeast US in the summer. But if after a cold winter they had low energy reserves, and many of them either would delay migration or not migrate at all. So actually after a cold winter you'd see a high biomass of bluefish in the southeast US. Opposite after a warm winter when they had lots of energy, and many of them would migrate. So seeing these kinds of somewhat predictable responses across species within communities has led us to ask whether we can then scale up even further to understand changing composition of ecological communities. And we've been sort of tiptoeing into this in a few different ways. One of the ways is just asking, sort of first order question is the richness of species in these communities changing through time? So his work led by a postdoc in the lab, Ryan Batt. He's looking again at these bottom trawl surveys from around North America. So Eastern Bering Sea down here, Gulf of Mexico up here. And one of the things that was striking, and not at all what I expected that we would find, is that species richness in each of these ecosystems has either been flat, or at least statistically flat, or is increasing. And that's consistent across these surveys. And that's after actually spending a lot of time thinking about observation probabilities and how those may be changing. Detection probabilities may be changing through time. So these are based on hierarchical Bayesian models that try to account for changes in observation probabilities and how that may be affecting the results that we're seeing. They're based on the spatial distribution of the new species that have entered these regions. They really do seem to be species that are moving in from adjacent regions. So it seems to be tied to this shift in species distribution, then contributing to changes in richness within a given region. And we can watch that colonization process happening over time in many of these regions. Ongoing work is now trying to understand exactly what are the demographic processes that are driving these changes. We're then also trying to go sort of the next step and think about changes to food webs. This work has been led by Becca Selden, another postdoc in the lab. And the sort of first approach she's been taking is to think about overlap between predator and prey. Right? For a predation event to happen, to first order, predator and prey need to be in the same place. And so cod, historically an important predator in the northeast U.S., and herring continues to be an important prey species. But go back to the late 1970s, again from these ecological surveys, about half the overlap between the two, so about half of the herring range was covered by cod. Fast forward a few decades, herring range actually had expanded quite a bit. Cod range has contracted a bit, and it's about a third of the herring range that's overlapped by cod. And so relatively less opportunity for cod to be an important predator on herring. And tying those, Becca then tied those to changes in the environmental temperature. So thinking about shift in the cod distribution as a result of changes in temperature, as well as shift in the herring distribution as related to temperature. And what she found was that as temperature goes up, the importance of cod as a predator on herring goes down. And that actually is not just herring, but actually across a range of different prey species: sand lance, alewife, mackerel, squid. But there's some really interesting functional diversity within this ecosystem. So cod may be less important, but other predators are moving in to fill a relatively similar role. So relatively similar diets for species like spiny dogfish and some of the hakes, where their overlap actually on the distribution of these same prey increases with temperature. So the change in the food web from a functional perspective has been somewhat buffered by this diversity of thermal preferences. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind, perhaps. But I've shown you sort of from a range of different perspectives what I think that marine species are especially sensitive to warming. They are responding quickly and in many cases actually quite predictably to the warming and other changes in temperature that we've observed. And I think one of the things that I find especially fascinating, that they actually seem more sensitive and responding more quickly than what we're experiencing maybe in our daily lives in terms of terrestrial ecosystems, and where a lot of the research attention has gone as well. So one of the things that means, though, is that human activities that interact with the ocean really are at the front lines of adapting and responding to these changes, including fisheries. So what are the impacts on fisheries and people? And before I get into maybe some of the more tangible stories, I just want to make the fairly generic point that as climate affects demographic rates of populations, so just population growth rates, for example, affected by population size, yes, but intrinsic growth rates could go up, they could go down, we could have changes in carrying capacity as a result of changes in the environment. That actually affects the value of these stocks. So, for example, prices change as a result of changes, whether intrinsic population growth rates. They could go up, they could go down. So what that means is when we're talking about stocks of fisheries moving around, it's actually wealth that's moving around as well. So there will, from a human perspective, that also means winners and losers and negotiations that are going on. So to dive into some of the more specific stories that we've been trying to piece together, I just wanted to show you this example here. So red hake, one of the species in the northeast U.S. that's been shifting north especially rapidly. The black line shows the center of the red hake distribution over the last 45 years or so. They used to be centered off New Jersey. Now they're centered off Massachusetts. This is again from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center bottom trawl survey. So we can also plot, though, the mean latitude of the fisheries landings. And that's the red line here. It is also, this fishery has also shifted north. But I think that actually hides, the generalization actually hides a more interesting pattern where the red hake fishery and red hake shifted north at about the same rate until 1990 or so. And since then, red hake have continued shifting north into Massachusetts, but the fishery has not. Digging into why that's happened, it seems to be a number of reasons. One, this particular fishery uses a net with a small mesh. It's excluded from many parts of northern New England out of bycatch concerns. Concerned they'll catch yellowtail flounder and other species that are at low abundance. There's also aren't many markets for red hake up in northern New England. It's a species that doesn't transport very well, and the markets many of them are actually down at Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And then finally, the local ecological knowledge in terms of fishermen knowing how to go fishing for the species and knowing how to sort of build a business around them just isn't found in northern New England. So for a range of different reasons, the fishery has been shifting north more slowly than the fish have. And that's something we've seen across a range of different species, at least in the Northeast, that we've looked at so far, including summer flounder, American lobster, yellowtail flounder. And so that was some work I did a few years ago. Following up on that, I've been working with some social scientists to try to understand in more detail how these fisheries have been changing. Not just looking at landings, which is a pretty coarse metric of where fishing is happening, but actually looking more specifically at trip reports. So at least in the Northeast, most of the fishers have to file a report after they come back saying where they fished, what they caught, and what gear they used. And this really started in earnest in the mid-90s, has been going on since then. So they provide quite detailed information on where boats are going. And just to show you, I think, an especially interesting example, if we look at large trawl boats, fishing boats out of Beaufort, North Carolina, in the mid-1990s, on average, boats were fishing off North Carolina. Over the subsequent years, though, they've been shifting further and further north until now, actually, they're fishing primarily off New Jersey. And this is, I think, an interesting case of actually, in some ways, a specialist predator. These boats largely catch summer flounder. And summer flounder now have shifted their distribution quite a bit. Not only, actually, I should say, temperature is probably part of that shift, but then other changes like shifts in the size distribution are also probably playing a role in the shift that has been observed. But summer flounder are much more abundant off New Jersey now than they are off North Carolina. The red areas in that map underlying it are showing where summer flounder are most abundant. But one of the things that has, you might wonder, well, why aren't boats just landing summer flounder in New Jersey? That would be much easier just to go out from New Jersey rather than either trucking their boats up to New Jersey and then catching fish and steaming 500 kilometers down to North Carolina, or actually going both ways. And part of the reason actually seems to be that there's a spatial allocation of quota between these states. And that was based on where this fish was caught in the 1980s. And there's been no appetite for updating that, though obviously some stakeholders would really like to update that. Others would not. And this is, the quota is allocated based on, for landing. So they can fish wherever they want, but they have to land in the state where they